Hi everyone. This tutorial is going to pick up right where the last one left off, so if you haven't already completed the previous tutorial, make sure you start there. So in this tutorial, I already have my basic mechanics working. I have a character controller that moves around, I have objects in the scene that cause damage, I have a key I can pick up to unlock a door, and I have coins that I can pick up. So the next thing that I want to do is make this a little bit more visually interesting. I'm going to first replace all of my default shapes with actual models and textures. Then I'm going to add some particles, sound effects, and animations just to liven up the mechanics a bit. I'm going to be importing some assets, so the first thing I want to do is organize my assets folder to make it easier to find the things I'm going to import. So I'm going to create a couple of new folders. First, I'll create one called materials because I have a lot of materials around here. And I'll just select all of these and drop them in the materials folder. Next, I'll make a scripts folder and move my two player scripts in there, my regular player script and my 2D player script. And I will be doing these things for the 2D character as well. So the assets I'm going to bring in, I have a sprite sheet for my 2D character. I have a collectible for my 2D character, and a ground object and some spikes. Then for my 3D character, I have some 3D shapes here. I also have spikes for my 3D character. I have a platform to use as the ground, a pumpkin that I'm going to use as the character, and an extra, it's called a sci-fi platform, which I'm going to use as the door, actually. So I'm going to make a couple of different folders for these things. Oh, also in here I have a music file and a sound effect for collecting the objects. So we need a folder for models first of all. And then we'll also need one for audio. And one for textures, and one for sprites. I'm going to keep my textures and sprites separate because the textures, even though they're both PNGs, the textures are going to be applied to the models and the sprites will be actually placed on the sprite objects. So now let's import some of those assets. I'm going to open up my models folder, and I'm going to select all of my 3D assets that I'm going to use. You can get free 3D assets in a lot of different places. You can find them on the Unity Asset Store, or you can just find them on the web. So I'll bring those into my models folder. Next, I'm going to go to my textures folder. Most of the time, if you download models, you will get texture files with them. So I have a few different texture files here that I'm going to import. Now it is important when you are importing textures for a 3D model, when you import them you want those to be set as texture type default, and we'll see the other option in a moment. So I'm going to import the sprites next, and these will have a different import option. So even though these are still the same file type, these are all still PNGs, when I import my sprites, I missed two of them. When I import my sprites, I want to select all of them and change their texture type. Instead of default, I'm going to change it to Sprite, 2D, and UI, and hit apply. And you'll notice they get a little over arrow next to them once I've done that. So that's how I know they've imported correctly. So these will be used in the 2D version of the game. I'm also going to go ahead and import the audio that I have. Again, you can find free audio a lot of places online. Even on the Unity Asset Store, they have some free audio. You do want to make sure that you choose audio that has a supported file type. I generally use OGG or WAV. Those are the two best ones to use when you're working in Unity. I'm going to be using these sound effects and music for both the 3D and the 2D version. So let's go ahead and replace a couple of things with models. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the damage traps with spikes. So from my models folder, I have this ice spikes model. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag it and attach it to one of my damage cubes. And I can see it now, this damage cube has inside of it, it has a spike model, which is the one that I just imported. I'm going to adjust the spike model so that it lines up a little bit better with the trap zone. And now, so I don't need the cube anymore. I don't need visually to have a cube here. But this parent object, this cube object, has my trigger collider and it has my tag. So I still need this to actually trigger the things that are happening from the script. So rather than getting rid of this, I'm just going to turn off the mesh renderer, which will make the cube invisible. Then I can adjust the size of the box collider so that it fits better around those new spikes that I brought in. So I'm just going to make it a little bit thinner. And I want to make these look like they are made of ice. They were named ice spikes because that was what the modeler intended them to be. So I'm going to create a new material to use. And we could just, I could just put on one of the existing materials I have, but I'm going to create a new material and try to make it look like ice. So I'm actually going to name this ice, since that's what it's going to look like. And ice is normally a light blue color, so let's start there. Oops. And so that I can see it as I'm updating it, I'm going to drag it onto those spikes. So ice is also generally a little bit transparent. And the way that we do that with a material in Unity is there are these rendering modes up here at the top. And the default one is opaque, which means there's no transparency. From this dropdown, the one that I prefer for working with transparency is actually called Fade. This one has the best visuals in my opinion. So I'm going to choose Fade, and then from my color, I can now adjust the alpha level of those spikes. So I'll choose an alpha level somewhere in the middle. And I'm also going to sort of lower these into the ground a little bit. And the other option that we can do with the material is we can give it an emission. So if you check the box for emission here, you can specify an emissive color, which will sort of make it look like it's glowing. If you pick solid white, it will just make the whole object look like it's glowing white. So I'm going to give it just a little bit of a glow to it. And I'm going to make it a little bit more higher of an alpha value. Just slightly transparent. We don't want to see all the way through it. So now I have this trap that has the ice spikes as a child of it. And I want to now use this as my main trap. Unity has a way to make instances of objects that are all have the same visuals and the same functionality. Basically, they're just carbon copies of the same object, and that is called prefabs. A prefab is a type of object that has it has a lot of different information saved for it. It could have a material or a model. It could have a script attached to it. It could have a collider. Basically, any components that you attach to it. A prefab lets you keep track of all that information and have a copy of it that you can drag into your scene. So I'm going to make a new prefabs folder. And then into that prefabs folder, what I'm going to do is first I'm going to name this the parent object. I'm going to name it trap. And then I'm going to drag it into my prefabs folder. And here I can see it has a little preview of what that looks like. And I can drag it into the scene. So this will let me quickly replace all of the traps that I've already set up in here. So I'm just going to delete those other traps. And maybe give these a bit of a rotation. And we can still Control D to duplicate as well. Now the really nice thing about using prefabs is if you decide at some point that you want to make a change to all of your spike traps, what you can do is you can make the change to one of those objects. Say I want to use a different material. You can make that change to one of your objects, and then with that object selected, if you hit apply, that change happens to all of the instances of that prefab. So that lets you quickly make changes to all of the instances of that type of object that you're using. The next thing that I want to do is add an animation to these coins. So I want to have the coins rotating so that it draws the player's attention. To do this, I'm going to create a new animation. And before I do that, I'm actually going to create an animations folder. Then inside the animations folder, I'm going to right-click, create animation. Now this can get a little bit confusing because there's also animator controller and animator override, but we want to use animation with an N. And it should have a little sort of looks like a play button when we first create it. And we can give it a name. I'm going to name it spin because I'm going to have the coins spin. Then if I select one of my coins, and if I just take this spin animation and drag it down to the bottom right under add component, it's going to create an animator component with an R. So I had an animation, I dragged it onto my game object, and it created an animator. The animator controls which animation is going to be played. It allows you to trigger different animations at different times. And we'll actually use the animator in a little bit to trigger the door to open. But for now, the animator, all we need to know is it's going to trigger this spin animation automatically. So now we just actually need to set up the keyframes for that spin animation. And so with my coins still selected, I'm going to open Window, Animation, and once again, there's a little bit of room to get confused here. There's also Animator and Animator Parameter, but we want to use Animation with an N. To add keyframes to this, we'll just add Property and use the little triangle to toggle down and see under Transform, we're looking for Rotation. And you want to make sure to click the little plus next to it. If you don't see the plus, you might actually have to scroll to the right or left with the scroll bar at the bottom. That depends on the resolution of your screen. So hit the plus next to rotation, and it gives us a start keyframe and an end keyframe. And I'm going to, first of all, just delete that end keyframe because I'm going to make my own. And I want a little bit more space in my timeline. This is 1 second here, and I want my animation a little bit longer than 1 second. So you can use your scroll wheel to zoom out and then drag along the timeline. I'm just clicking and dragging where the numbers are. Drag along the timeline to 2 seconds. Now once again, I'm going to toggle open with the triangle, and I'm going to give a Y rotation here. I'm going to set it to 360. So it makes a full circle. And now if you drag along the timeline, you can actually preview what the animation is going to look like. You can also hit play and watch it as it plays. And you'll notice that even though it's looping, it has a spot in the middle where it pauses. So it gradually picks up speed, and then it slows down at the end, comes to a stop, and then it once again gradually picks up speed. If you want it to spin continuously and not have that little pause in between the loops, the way that we do that is with the Curves tab. And if you've used Maya or Max or other animating tools, you're probably familiar with how curves work. So the curves tell the animation how to ease in and ease out from different keyframes. If you want to bring the whole loop or the whole curve into focus, if you hit F, it centers everything in your screen. And now what we want to do is this has a pretty distinct ease in at the beginning, and then it reaches full speed in the middle, and then it eases out at the end. And we don't want it to ease in or out. We actually want this to be a straight line. So you can click on the keyframe and then drag the handle, and we're just aiming for as close as possible to a straight line here. Now if we preview, we should see a mostly continuous animation. Now the last thing that we need to do is to set it to loop. So if you select your spin animation in the inspector, there's a checkbox called loop time. Now when I hit play, I should be able to see my coin animates continuously until I pick it up. So now I need to apply this to my other coins, and if I had made this a prefab, I would be able to just apply that change right now, and it would add that animation to all of the other coins. But I have not made this a prefab yet, so we can see there's no apply option at the top like we had for the traps. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a prefab now. That way if I make future changes, that'll be easier to handle. So first I'll name it coin. Then in my prefabs folder, I'll take that coin and drag it in. Now I'm going to delete my other coins that I have in the scene, and I'm going to drag in this new coin that I'm going to be using. Now all of the coins should be spinning. So the next thing that I want to do is have my door animate. So when I pick up the key and I walk up to the door, instead of having it disappear, I want to have it animate. So just like we did with the coin, the first thing I'm going to do is create a new animation. I'll just right click in my animations folder, create animation. I'll call it door open. I'll select my door and just drag that animation to the bottom. Now it's created an animator component. I'm going to go ahead and name this door so I can find it more easily in my hierarchy. And just as we did before, the first thing is to go to Window, Animation, and set up our keyframes. I'm going to this time use Position. And just like I did before, I'm going to delete the end keyframe so I can make my own. But this time, instead of specifying the numbers in here, I'm actually just going to drag this up and position it where I want it. Then I'll right click in this space here in the center one and add key. And if I hit play, I can watch that animation. Now it's looping in the preview, but I'm not going to check the box for preview because I don't want the door to open continuously. So I'm leaving this unchecked. If I hit play right now, I can see that the door just opens automatically. And what I want to do is actually trigger that animation to happen. So I'm going to now go to the Animator window with an R. So that's under Window, Animator with an R. And I need to select my door in order to see the animator component. Here's my door open animation, and this entry here means right at the beginning, it's going to trigger this animation to play. Rather than having this animation play, I'm going to create an empty animation in here. So right click, create state, empty. And then once again, right click on this new state, set as default state. Now this is going to be the thing that plays by default when I hit play. Now if I want a way to trigger this to happen, what I need to do is make a transition. So on my new empty state, I'm going to right click, make transition, and now I have a little arrow that I can drag around. I'm going to drag it to door open. And now I need to make a parameter to trigger this. That's going to be under the parameters tab. I'll hit the little plus icon here to add a new parameter. And what I'm going to add is a trigger. The trigger's name is going to be open with a capital O. And we want to remember how we spell this because this is what we are going to call from the script in a little bit. So if I select my transition here, and when I have it selected, it turns blue. Down here at the bottom is the conditions for that transition. So here if we hit plus, if we only have one condition, it's automatically going to choose that one. If we had other conditions, we would have to choose from this drop down. The other thing I want to do is uncheck this box for has exit time, because has exit time basically says as soon as one animation is done, play the next. And this animation is empty, so as soon as it stops playing this empty animation, which would be right away, it would basically happen instantly, and then it would automatically go to play this one. So we unchecked the box for has exit time, and we specified our condition as this open trigger. Now we actually need to call this trigger from our script. So let's go ahead and open up our player script. And where I want to set this trigger is going to be, it's going to be an on trigger enter. Now it's easy to get confused by this. This is actually a different kind of trigger. On trigger enter is a physical collider trigger in the scene. The kind of trigger we're using for the animation is an animation trigger. So they use the same term, but they are different things. So inside my on trigger enter function, I'm going to go to the section where I'm colliding with the door. And instead of destroying the door, I'm just going to replace this line here. Instead, I'm going to do other dot get component because I want to get this component from the collider that I just the thing that I just collided with. So I collided with the door, and I want to get a component that's on the door, and that component is the animator with an R. That goes in the corner brackets, and then I still need the open and close parenthesis. Now I'm going to do dot set trigger, and this is going to set the trigger for the animator to switch between animations. And so this goes in parentheses and in quotes. And here's where I put the name of the trigger that I made, which was called open with a capital O. And with a semicolon. And now let's save that and test it. So it doesn't open when I walk up to it without the key, but if I walk over and pick up the key, now when I walk up to the door, it animates open. The next thing I'm going to do is replace these coins with a different model, and rather than just creating a material, this time I'm actually going to use a texture. So with one of my coins selected, I'm going to, just like we did with the ice spikes, I'm going to use we'll make this skull that I have here. This is a Halloween set of assets that I'm using today. So I'm going to use this skull, and I'm going to make it a child of the coin object. And let's go ahead and zero out the position and rotation. And you might notice that it is flattened out, and that's because when we first started, we actually flattened our cylinder. And so I need to scale my my skull so that it is not squashed. And then I can drag it over so that it's more centered into the middle of the coin. Now I'm going to turn off the coin mesh renderer, just like we did before. And I have a texture for the skull in my textures folder. So the way that we work with the textures is we can just take the texture and drag it onto the skull object. And it's a little difficult to tell with this lighting. I'm going to add another light so we can actually see the texture when it applies. So I'm going to undo that just so it goes back to being gray. And I'm going to create game object, light, point light. And point lights really help a lot to see better detail in your scene. So I do recommend adding a few point lights around your scene so you can actually see the shapes better. So now I can see a better outline of the skull shape. So when I take my texture and drag it onto the skull, I can see that as soon as I apply the texture, it automatically attaches itself to the model. And it's actually creating a new material for me. So it created this new material and even put it in my materials folder. Unity is set up to look for a materials folder. If it's spelled correctly, it will attempt to put your the material in there for you that it created. So now I have a skull model inside of my coin, and I set my coin to invisible. And so now if I hit apply, I can see that it applies that to all of the other coins, which are now skulls. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change out the model for my character. I'm going to use the pumpkin model. And once again, I'm going to zero out the position and the rotation. My pumpkin model appears to be on its side, so I'm actually going to rotate it to be upright. And then I'm just going to position it so that it fits nicely within the cube. Then I can turn off the mesh render on the cube. And for my pumpkin, I'm going to go and find my pumpkin texture and apply that to the pumpkin model. I'm going to rotate it around a little bit so that I'll actually be able to see it from the camera. So now I have a pumpkin walking around the scene that picks up these skulls. Now you might notice that it seems a little odd that the pumpkin is just always facing in the same direction. It didn't really matter when we were using a cube, but once you add a model, if you want the model to actually turn and face the direction that you're moving, we can do that in the script. So one way to do that is instead of the right and left arrow adding force, we can actually have the right and left arrow change the rotation. So this would be transform.rotate, and we give it the angle that we want to rotate around, which is actually the up vector. So this would be vector3.up. And just like we did before when we were translating, we want to multiply by time.delta time. So this is frame rate independent. And then multiply by some number so that so it's not too tiny of a value. Now for the left arrow, I want it to rotate the opposite direction. So to do that, transform.rotate vector3.up times time.delta time. And so this time we'll multiply by -10. So it'll rotate in the opposite direction. Control S to save our script. And now let's test it out. So that's rotating just a little bit too slowly. I can also see that now my my transform, or my move, my up and down arrows, they're always moving up and down, and they're not moving the forward direction of the character. So two things we need to do. First of all is we need the pumpkin to actually face the forward direction. And the forward direction is this blue arrow here. So what I want to do is rotate the pumpkin around so that it is facing that forward vector. And then the next thing we need to do is in our script, instead of doing vector3.forward and vector3.back, what we're going to do is actually transform.forward, which is the forward for the actual object rather than forward in world space. Now there isn't actually a transform.back. So what we need to do is transform.forward times a negative number. So we'll do times -30. While I'm in here, I am also going to increase how quickly my rotation happens because it seemed a little bit slow. And we'll Control S to save, and then let's test that out. So now my forward and backward actually matches the direction that the character is facing. The rotation is still a little too slow. So let's try again. Let's jump it all the way up to 40. And you know what? Just to make it easier for when I'm testing, I'm going to make my ground larger so I stop falling off. And I think I'm actually going to make my force a little bit less. The force is just a little bit too strong. And I'm going to keep increasing my rotation speed. I'm still not happy with how fast it is. Let's jump all the way up to 100. All right, so now our little character rotates around to the direction that we want to face. And I'm lost somewhere behind the wall. Okay, so that's good enough for our models. I am now going to, before I get into sound and particles, I'm actually going to switch over for a moment and do these same steps with the 2D version. So if you're doing a 3D version and you don't want to see how to do it in 2D, you can just skip ahead in the video to where the sound starts. So let's go to our 2D scene. Make sure you save your work in the 3D scene. So in the 2D scene, it's actually a little bit easier. We don't have to deal with making child objects. If we select our player, actually let's start with the ground. So if we select our ground, then just for where the sprite is, if you click on the circle next to the sprite, I'm going to use my ground sprite that I brought in. And that sprite is a little bit too big. So we can scale this down first of all. But now that we've scaled it down, probably our box collider 2D is too small. So let's scale this up until we can see where that's at. Okay, so let's try 20 for this. So it goes about all the way across. Let's do 18. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to scale my ground up so that it goes all the way across the screen. And we want to make sure that the top of the collider lines up pretty closely with this. It's just a little bit high, so I'm going to lower it down just a tiny bit. And since this ground that I'm using, it's not perfectly flat, it's okay if the collider is not perfectly inlined. So next I'm going to switch the trap. So once again, I'm going to click the circle next to Sprite, and I'm going to select the spikes that I brought in. Once again, it's very large, and also you'll notice that even though they were purple in the preview, they appear red now. That's because I have a color applied here, which I was doing for when I was using a square. So I want to change this color to white, so they use the actual color from the PNG. So once again, I need to scale this back down to a reasonable size, and probably even a little bit smaller than that. And I need to once again adjust my box collider so that it fits around this this new spikes that I'm using. You want to make sure when you're doing something like a trap that your collider doesn't go outside of the shape, because then the player will see that they're not actually touching the shape, and they might be upset if it seemed like they got hit by the trap. So let's hit play and take a look at how that looks. So I can see down here at the bottom, I can see when I'm taking damage. Now my health is at 80. Now it's at 70. And if I jump, I can get over it. Let's also go ahead and switch the coins, the sprite I'm using here. Once again, I'm going to click on the circle, and I'm going to use this collectible that I brought in for that. And once again, I want to change the color to white, so it will use the actual color of the PNG. And we'll scale that until we get about the right size that we want. And we're going to run into the same thing we did before, where these are not a prefab, so we can't automatically replace them. So I am going to make this collectible into a prefab. This one I'm going to name collectible so as not to confuse it with the coin. Oops. And even though it's a 2D object, I can still drag it into my prefabs folder and make a prefab out of it. And then I can easily drag it in from my prefabs folder. Now, for 2D, it's a little bit different how we put animations on things. And the only thing that I brought in an animation for is the player. So let's go ahead and do the player now, and we can see how to do animations. And this would be the same if you wanted to animate any of your other things as well. So what I brought in for my player into this sprites folder is a sprite sheet. And the sprite sheet is just a normal PNG when I saved it. But it has, as you can see here in the preview, you can see it has multiple frames of an animation. So what I would need to do now in Unity is I need to slice this so that each frame can be played separately, and Unity will stitch it together to make an animation. And we'll do that with the sprite editor. But before we edit the sprite, we need to switch the sprite mode from single to multiple. And now we can open the sprite editor, and we'll hit apply. And in the sprite editor, we're going to do a slice. And instead of automatic, let's do by cell count. So now I can tell it how many columns and how many rows it has. This particular sprite sheet just has one row, but it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns. So I'm going to put 7 for the columns and 1 for the row. And if we hit slice, if you zoom way in, you can see a little faint white line here. And actually you can click on it and you can see. So this is how it has sliced it. So it's important when you're finding a sprite sheet, or if you're making a sprite sheet yourself, that the character is always perfectly centered in what is going to become the frame, including at the very edge. So you need to leave the exact right amount of buffer space at the edge as you would have to the center point between two of the frames. So now we can close out of this window and hit apply. And now if I hit the triangle next to my cat sprite, I can see I have each of these different frames of the animation. So now if I select my player, and with my circle, I can see that I have each of these options for the cat. Now an easier way to do this for a sprite sheet is if you take the actual sprite sheet itself and drag it into the scene, it actually attempts to create a new animation for you. And then you can put that animation in your animations folder. I'm going to name this cat run. So again, to do that, I just took the entire sprite sheet object and dragged it into my scene, and it automatically created an animation for me. Now with this selected, I can go to my animation window and I can preview that animation. So this is what the animation will look like. So this time I am going to go back to the way that I did it for 3D, where I'm going to take this new thing I've created. I'm going to make it a child of the player. I'm going to 0 the position. And I'm going to shrink it down just a little bit so that it fits inside of that square. Then on the actual parent player object, I'm going to uncheck the sprite renderer. So now that sprite is invisible. And now I just have the cat as the visible thing, but my parent object still has the collider and the rigid body and the script. And so now I have my cat sprite sheet animation playing, and I can run around. Now for this one, if you want the sprite to switch directions when you are changing directions with the arrow keys, we'll have to do that again in the script. So let's open up our 2D player script. I find the easiest way to do this is to actually, rather than trying to make the calculations inside of the script, to reverse and scale and modify the sprite, I find the easiest thing to do is actually to just duplicate it and mirror it. So I'll do negative for the X, and I want to adjust those so they are right on top of each other. And so I'll have one cat that's the forward cat and one cat that's the backwards cat. And I will set one of them invisible at the default. Then in my script, I'm just going to pick which one is visible based on which way I'm going. So I'm going to make 2 public game objects. This will allow me to access those in the scene. I'll call one forward cat. And I will call the other one backward cat. Then in my script, if I'm using the right arrow, I want to make sure forward cat is the one that's enabled. So I will do forward cat dot set active, which turns an object on or off in the scene. We'll do true. And I'm going to turn off backward cat. So backward cat dot set active false. And then we need to do the reverse of that when I'm using the left arrow key. So backward cat dot set active true, and forward cat dot set active false. And this set active is the same thing as when I turned it off here in the scene. So this checkbox up here, this is that set active function. So now I just need to specify which one is forward cat and which one is backward cat. So with my player selected, the parent object, I'll go down to the 2D script, and I just realized I forgot to save that. Make sure you save it, otherwise it won't show up in your scene. So if we save that, and now on my player, I have a slot for forward cat and a slot for backward cat. So I'll put the first one in the forward cat slot and the last one in the backward cat slot. Now let's test it out. So now my cat runs the direction that I'm pressing with the arrow key. All right, so now we're ready to add sounds and particles. And this will be basically the same in 2D and 3D. I'm going to hop back over to 3D for the first iteration of this. So let's save this first, and then let's open our 3D scene. Make sure we switch back into 3D view. So we need to add a particle effect and a sound effect. We're going to do this when the pumpkin picks up the skulls. So each time I collect one of the skulls, I want a sound effect and a particle effect to play. To do this, we're going to first create an empty game object. This is going to be the thing that has the particle effect and sound effect on it. So I'm going to name this as effect. And I'm going to do add component here. Add a particle system. And when you first create a particle system, you'll see that it starts off with these sort of ugly purple squares. So first thing we want to do whenever we create a new particle system is scroll all the way to the bottom where it says renderer. Click on this renderer to toggle it open, and then under material, click on the circle next to the material slot. And if we scroll through here, you can bring in your own particle textures if you want, or you can get some from the Unity Asset Store, or you can use the basic standard Unity Asset Pack. But even if you don't import anything at all, you always have this default particle as one of your options. So for this demo, I'm just going to use this default particle. Now, there's a lot of settings that you can change in the particle system. But I'm going to try to keep it simple. I'm just going to make a few changes. And if you have a lot of time and you want to play around with it, you can go crazy with all of the different settings. So the first thing I'm going to change is the shape. If you toggle open the shape window, you can see that it's set to a cone. And if I switch this to sphere, this will make all of my particles go out in random directions rather than all traveling in one direction. We can also change the size of the sphere. So I'm going to make this smaller so they all sort of come out of the center. And if we want this to be sort of a spontaneous effect that happens when we pick something up, we probably don't want the particles continuously coming out. Instead, we want what's called a burst. So under emission, I'm going to turn down this rate over time. This says how many particles are being emitted. And if you turn this all the way down to 0, you won't have any particles coming out over time, but you can add a burst with this little plus button here. And so this will have all of the particles burst out at once. And it's set to loop right now, and I'm going to leave it that way while I'm editing it just because it makes it a little bit easier. But when I'm done, I'm going to turn off loop. But this is right now, it's taking a really long time to go play all the way through. So I do want to make this faster. Up at the top, we have two settings, start lifetime and duration, and I'm going to set both of those to 1. I also feel like maybe I want some gravity applied to these particles. So gravity modifier, I'm also going to give it a 1. Now if you want your particles to have sort of an upward burst before they fall, that setting would be velocity over lifetime. And if I open this one up, I can see everything is grayed out. This one is not selected by default. So if we want to add this, we use this checkbox here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this down arrow and choose curve. And I can see it's added a curve for the X, Y, and Z values. I just want to use the Y. So I'm going to turn off X and Z. And I'm just going to drag this start keyframe up for Y. And I can even change this number here. I could make this larger if I wanted a more upward poof for this. These particles are also really kind of large, so I'm going to change the start size from 1 to 0.4. That looks a little bit better. And the other thing that I like doing with particles that I feel like makes it a lot better is color over lifetime. This is, once again, this is grayed out by default. We have to check the box next to it if we want to use it. And then from this color gradient here, we have 2 options we can change here. The top is the alpha and the bottom is the actual color. So for the top one, what I find looks really nice is to have it in the middle, and I click in this space here and it creates a new handle. I like to have an alpha of 255 in the middle, and at the beginning and end, an alpha of 0. So the particles fade in and out, so they don't just sort of spontaneously appear and disappear. I'm also going to add a color handle in the middle, which I'm going to use yellow. And once you're happy with your particle system, then you want to make sure that you go up to the top and uncheck the box for looping. Now you notice once you uncheck that box, you don't get to see it previewing anymore. Anytime you want to see it, you have to hit play. That's why I generally leave it looping while I'm working on it. So now we have a particle system on here, and the next thing we need to do is add a sound effect to it. Sound effect is a lot easier. We just go to the bottom and hit add component. Start typing in audio. We want audio source for this. And I'm going to go and find the audio that I imported. So I'm going to use this collect sound effect. And with my effect selected down at the bottom, I'm going to take this collect sound effect and drag it into the audio clip slot. I'm going to leave everything else set the way that it is. It's set to play on awake, and it's not set to loop. This is what I want. Play on awake means that it will play as soon as this object comes into existence, and that's the same for play on awake for the particle system. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create this object when I want the effect to play. So I do want it to play as soon as that object is created. Now we need to actually call that from our script to get it to happen. And what we're going to do is we're going to use something called resources. So I'm going to create another folder called resources. And up until now, you could actually name your folder anything you want. But with the resources, you actually do need to spell it exactly how Unity wants it to be spelled. This is actually creating resource objects for Unity to access from scripts. So it needs to be spelled with a capital R. It needs to be resources with plural ending in S. And now with that open, I can drag my effect into that folder. And I now have this as a resource that I can load into the scene from a script. I'm going to go ahead and delete the one that I have in the scene currently because I don't need that one anymore. And instead, I'm going to go into my script. Make sure we're working in the 3D script since we're in the 3D screen. And in the coin section of my onTrigger enter, right before I destroy the coin, or right after, it doesn't really matter, but right in this section, I'm going to do something called instantiate, which creates a new object in the scene. And here we specify the object we're going to create. And here's where we use our resources. So we'll do resources dot load. So this tells Unity, go and find the resources folder and load this object, which I'm going to put in quotes. And so we need to remember what we called our object, which was effect. So this says go to the resources folder and load this object into the scene. Now we also need to give it a position and rotation. I'm going to give it the position of the thing I collided with. So that would be other.transform.position. And same with the rotation. So I'll use other.transform.rotation. You could give a specific position or rotation if you wanted to here, but for what we're doing right now, it makes the most sense to spawn this object right where the coin was when we collected it. So let's save that and test it out and see if it works. So I can see it's playing a particle effect and a sound effect when I pick up that object. The last thing I'm going to do for the 3D version is I'm going to add a background music to my game. And I generally like to attach this to the camera just to make it easier to find where it's at. So on my camera object, I'm going to add an audio source component. I'm going to leave it set to play on awake, but this is going to be background music, so I also want to check the box for loop. You can also change things like the volume or the pitch, and for my music, I actually know that the volume is too loud, so I'm going to turn this down just so that it doesn't come through too loudly in the recording. Now I'm going to go and find that music and drag it into the audio clip slot. So now I have background music and I have sound effects for when I pick up my skulls, and I have all of my mechanics working. So we can quickly add that into the 2D version as well. So if we hop back into our 2D scene, save our changes, and I'm going to try just using the same particle effect that I made before and see if that shows up okay in the 2D version. So that effect that I put in my resources folder, I'm actually just going to go ahead and load that with my 2D script as well. So I can actually just go ahead and copy this line and drop it into my 2D script. This is also in my onTrigger enter 2D section in the coin spot. Save that, and also add our background music to the camera. Just like we did before, we want to make sure to check the box for loop, and I'm going to turn the volume down on that. And then just drag the music into the audio clip slot. Now test it out. And that works for my particle effect here as well. Now if you wanted to set up your character animation so that it wasn't looping continuously, that's actually done in the animator just like we did for the door open. So you can use the same principles we used for triggering that animation to figure out how to trigger when to run this sprite animation. So that about does it for our particles, sounds, and animation. The one last thing we might like to do here is add some text on the screen. So we have a couple things we're keeping track of, and we've seen those in the console popping up. We have how many collectible things we've collected, and we have how much health we have left when we take damage. So if we wanted to put that on the screen, This is, by the way, this is the same in both 2D and 3D. So I'm just going to do this in the 2D one, but it is exactly the same in the 3D. So what we would want to do is create a UI game object. So from the game object drop down, go into UI. And like I said, this is exactly the same for both 2D and 3D. So in the UI, we have a text option. And when I select that, it has created a canvas object. And if I double click on this, I can see this is the canvas object. It's way bigger than my scene. That'll be true in both 2D and 3D. You'll see your scene is this very small little area down here, and your canvas is this great big area up here. The canvas is rendered by a different camera. So when you're working with your canvas, just ignore how big it is and where it's located. So this text that I created is actually sort of off screen. This window here is what's going to be the screen for my canvas. So I'm going to drag this onto the screen, and you can jump back and forth between your game window to see where that text is. I'm going to position it sort of in the top of my screen. And we have some options for the text. First, we have the color. I'm going to go ahead and change the color so it's bright so I can see it in my window here. And then you could also change the size. And if you make the size too large, you might notice it disappears. That's because it has a bounding box for the text. And you just want to make that larger if your text size is too big. So let's just make this larger so we can see it. So now my text comes back. And here in this box, I can specify what the text says. So I could say gold 0. And what I want to do now is be able to update this from the script. One other thing, actually, while I'm on this, though, is the position of the text is going to change depending on the screen resolution that your player is using. So if you want something to always be in the top left corner of the screen, like I do for this text, this anchor point here, or this bound, sets it to where it's going to displace itself from. So if you leave it set to the center, what's going to happen is on different size screens, it's going to end up getting pushed off the screen. So if I want it to stay in this corner, I actually want to choose this top left corner option here. So now it will stay positioned based on this, this top left corner. And so the next thing that I need to do is in my script, change how I am setting this text. So we're going to actually access this text field here to update that. So let's hop back into our 2D player script. And before we can access that text, we need to add something to the top, just like we did for accessing Unity's scene management. We need to add using Unity Engine .ui. This will allow us to access Unity's UI elements. So now I'm going to make another public object, just like we did for the cat. I'm going to make a public, this time I'm going to make it a text rather than a game object. So I'm going to do public text, and I'm going to name this gold. Now I can, once I drag that into the slot in my scene, I'll be able to access that text, and I can update the text that it's displaying. So let's add that into our on trigger enter section where we're collecting our coin. We're going to do gold dot text. This is going to be text with a lowercase t. So when we created the text object, it's with a capital T. But to access the actual text field, that's a lowercase t. And we'll do equals, and in quotes, we'll say gold. And make sure you leave a space here. And then plus, which is, in scripting, this is to concatenate two different strings. So this will be, it'll display this first, and then after that, it'll display this other thing we put over here, which is going to be our coin count variable. Now, one problem with the way we're doing this here is we're actually updating our display before we're updating our coin. So I'm actually just going to take this, I'm going to Control X, I'm going to move it down here to the bottom. and Control V to paste it down here so that we're actually waiting until we've updated this coin count variable before we update our display. Now Control S to save, and let's test it out. And I forgot to attach the text to the player. So here we can see a null reference, which happens when you are trying to access something from a script that that script cannot find. So when you see one of these pop up, it pops up down here in red. When you see one of these pops up, that means that something's gone wrong and it's an issue in your script that's not working. So what's going wrong here is that on my player, I'm looking for this gold text, but I didn't actually drag anything into this slot. So here's where I want to take my text from my canvas, drag it into my gold slot, and now let's try it out again. And now I hit them all really fast, but you can see my gold went up to 3. I'll try to be a bit more careful and hit them more slowly this time. So you can see that the gold goes up by 1 each time I collect one of those coins or candy hearts. So that does it for adding visuals, sound effects, particle effects, animations, and UI. So this that I did for the text, you could do the exact same thing for the health. You would do the exact same thing where you would make a public text object here for your health, and then you would update it when you take damage. So that would be the exact same. Similarly, you could do the same thing in the 3D version. You'd really just need to copy and paste what you did here and put that into your 3D version. So that about does it for this demo. I hope you've enjoyed learning how to do these simple mechanics in 2D and 3D, and how to liven up your scene with art, sound, and effects and animations. Thanks for watching.